The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendrix, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Your work always gets better in community. And I think it's because we believe the sort of liturgies that our culture has taught us about artists, that they're solitary, they're selfish, they're inward looking. And that's usually not the case, that we need others. And we often make our best work when we allow someone else to collaborate with us.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. John Hendrix is a New York Times best-selling author and illustrator. His books include The Faithful Spy, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and The Plot to Kill Hitler, which NPR named the best book of 2018. Drawing is Magic, Discovering Yourself in a Sketchbook, Miracle Man, The Story of Jesus, The Holy Ghost, a spirited comic, and many others. His award-winning illustrations have also appeared on book jackets, newspapers, and magazines all over the world. The Society of Illustrators named John the Distinguished Educator in the Arts for 2024. He is the Kenneth E. Hudson Professor of Art and the founding chair of the MFA in Illustration and Visual Culture program at Washington University in St. Louis. John's new graphic novel is The Mythmakers, the remarkable fellowship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. In this episode, John and I talk about the nature of myth, the creative power of friendship, the beginning of the Inklings, and the sad end of the Inklings. John Hendrix, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast today. I'm so excited about your new book, The Mythmakers. Help me out with the subtitle.
The Remarkable Fellowship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Well, thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Where to start? I mean, it's such a remarkable friendship. It's hard to imagine in terms of culture, what friendship was more productive than that friendship between those two people. And that I know there are plenty of other, art people who've been friends and have that's been productive. But maybe we'll start there. Why are you so excited about this particular? So I'm reframing. There are lots of artists who are friends with each other.
Yes.
And
so why pick these two? Two, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just to jump back to that just a second. Like, again, we have to remember that these two men in their middle 40s were meeting together as academics and professors, and they did not know that they were C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, right? They were mid-career people that were attempting to do something purely for enjoyment, and I think purely for their own edification and friendship. And they accidentally like re-enchanted the world, which is insane. They sold from, this small little idea, 250 million copies of their books. And we are still almost now 80 years later making film adaptations of these works. Like, it's just so unlikely. I mean, I think just people set out to write bestsellers and to change the world, and these two were just not interested in that. So again, it's a wild story. And so some of that is why I was interested in doing this book. But if I'm honest, the core of it is like, this is fan art to me. Like I'm just so indebted to these two for a lot of reasons. Like The Hobbit for me was a portal to just the world of imagination. I carried around my copy of The Hobbit like it was the Bible. Even when I had finished reading it, it was a comfort tome to me. It had the illustrations, it had the story.
Yeah.
And I just owed them so much that I this was a dream to be able to do a little tribute to them.
Okay. So when you say you owed them to so much, did that make things harder for you in some ways?
Yeah. How do you live up to that? Right. Like in some way I owe them like that. They validated imagination and weird things frankly in the Christian space. Like they were a kind of beacon of like, oh, you can make art that is unusual. That I remember reading the Screw Tape letters and just being blown away that something could be both poignant and funny and incisive and thoughtful all at once. And so, I mean, that's part of what I feel like is that they're like that sort of North Star for a lot of my early childhood.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I asked was did it make it harder for you to feel like you owed so much? Years ago, like I got a contract to write 2 biographies, one of St. Patrick and one of Flannery O'Connor.
Oh, man.
And I like St. Patrick. I love St. Patrick. Didn't know a ton about him before I, got this contract. And it really wasn't that hard to write a book about St. Patrick. I liked him fine. And I liked him more as I went on. But then when it came to Flannery O'Connor, she was such an incredible, part of my imaginative map and my work and everything.
Yeah. How do you possibly give the right amount of love and honor? And
yeah. And it was really, really hard. Yeah. And I sat down every day thinking about the 50 people I could knew by name that'd be more qualified to do this than me,
Yes. No, I think I tell this to my students all the time, the feelings of just being a perpetual fraud never leave you. I don't know what, maybe there are people that they do. And actually those people are probably psychopaths, but the idea that like, I am the wrong person to be telling this story, or so many people are more qualified, or honestly, any of my books, my Bonhoeffer book, like you, for me, I have to like put on this hat of like being an amateur expert where I can make definitive statements about somebody where I've not spent nearly enough time in the trenches of scholarship that, Fleming Rutledge or Malcolm Guite or any of these people that have done. So you do feel a little bit fraudulent. I totally understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you set out to tell these men's story in, we don't call this a graphic novel. What's the term of art here for what this?
I think actually graphic novel is a great one. I mean, that's about as close as you're going to get. My books are a blend of prose and imagery and comics and maps. And, it is an unusual format. Have been books that have attempted these kind of like hybridized, blended word, image, text, images, like Hugo Cabret is a notable example. And Brian Selznick's book. And that's one I drew a lot of inspiration from. And so, but I do think graphic novel is a fine way to categorize it. But it's when I describe these books, they're 100% words and they're 100% images. So they're meant to toggle back and forth between those two things. But I think the stew I'm creating in a reader's mind is kind of a third thing that is neither word nor image. And that's this kind of gestalt. That's the art school idea of, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And so when you build imagery, narrative, word, prose, illustrated type, all these things can create a kind of, a visual soup in your mind. And I love that.
It's a leaf mold, a pile of leaf mold to borrow.
That's right.
Oh.
Yes.
All right. So you've got, besides Lewis and Tolkien, you've also got this other layer of a lion and a wizard who, how would you describe what, I guess they're narrators.
Yeah, they are. They're sort of the guides for the story. And then this lion and wizard totally picked at random. I just assigned two, nouns.
Yeah. Right.
No, so obviously they are avatars for our protagonists, right? And they did some things for me. Not only did they make the book more fun, but the hilarious thing about a graphic novel about the two members of the Inklings is most of the things that they're doing is just literally talking to each other.
Yeah.
And that's just visually very uninteresting after a while.
Yeah.
So Lion and Wizard allow me to send them on some of the adventures that Tolkien and Lewis are talking about in theory and in practice. And it just gives the readers another way to sort of shepherd through the story. And then it allows me at the end to have a little fun with, because this is a nonfiction book and I'm really trying to be faithful to the scholarship. Part of me selfishly just wanted to have Jack and Tollers together having conversations and to listen in on what that would feel like. Yeah. So Lion and Wizard allow us to kind of get to be friends with them without getting so egregious to make all the scholars want to throw me off of a cliff. I really don't want to put words into their mouth unless it's very clear that I'm fictionalizing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the little device you have of inserting an asterisk wherever you actually are quoting them.
Yeah. No, I think it's helpful just to remind people like, okay, here's a sourced conversation. This is a quote. And then the rest of it, I'm helping you sort of leap from fact to fact with that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So Lion and Wizard, surprisingly, their conversation about the technicalities of myth and legend and now I'm forgetting what the other.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Epic. Yeah.
Epic. Yeah. Are a little more technical than what Jack and Tollers are saying to one another. And I love the way you use, again, the pictures and the words to help simplify some pretty complex ideas. But I'm curious to know, like, did your editors give any pushback on getting so technical about? I mean, you've said this is your target audience is young adult.
Yeah, I did get pushback, and my editors are often asking me, "Who is this book really for outside of yourself?" And of course, yes, that's a really good question to ask any writer.
Yeah.
But again, in my mind, this is for a young mind that's like just beginning to read, maybe Beowulf, like maybe this is early high school. And what I love about the books that I make is trying to make complexity very legible. Like that act of translating to me, like I love when people do that for me. Like a TED Talk does that. Yeah. You take someone's expertise and you have like 9 minutes to jump into the very deepest parts of their research, but somehow it's clear. Yeah. To me, that's a total magic trick. So yeah, the idea of like what makes an epic and a fairy tale and a legend and all these things different and distinct, and why is myth wholly different than all of those things? Trying to give a lens, and in this case, Lion and Wizard get attacked by a giant spider. They turn the spider into a stone statue that sort of represents, those pieces of unpacking layers of that diagram. And again, will everyone retain every part of this? Probably not, but I love the challenge of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk to me about this idea of myth. And it's in the title. That myth is at the center of this friendship between Lewis and Tolkien.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not asking you to get as technical as Lion and Wizard.
Honestly, this could be the entire podcast, but I'll make it short. The very first thing we see in the book, the cold open, essentially, is Lewis and Tolkien meeting at a faculty meeting. And the thing that they talk about is Norse mythology. Yeah. They connect over a love of this Norse myth. And it'd be like today meeting someone at a faculty meeting and they're like wearing a Marvel t-shirt or something. Yeah. And you're like, oh my gosh, you love Green Lantern. It was like that. They were like geeking out on their favorite fan stuff. And that little spark was what connected them. And of course, at the time, Lewis he was a cynical atheist that allowed himself the sort of guilty pleasure of enjoying these ridiculous myths. And they awoke in him this joy that he couldn't explain. And so the title, of course, refers to them, of course, as two myth makers, but also extends beyond to humanity. Why does humanity keep telling the same stories? And ultimately to God, like to Tolkien lands his sort of death blow, or in this case, a life blow on Lewis with his conversation on Addison's Walk and the wonderful Mythopoeia, where he says we make myths because we were made by a myth maker. And so that it's really, if you pull too hard on that thread, the questions you get are going to unravel a lot.
Yeah. By the way, I don't know if you put it together, but this is the anniversary of that. We're talking on September 19th, which was the date of the Addison Walk.
That's right. That's right. It's an amazing day. Let's see. What was the year? It was
31. Does that sound
31? Right? Yeah. Okay. So it's not like it's not like 5 or 10. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Lewis and Tolkien, I'd not put together how similar their childhoods were. How many parallels, or I say not let's say their early life.
Yeah. They lost their mom. They were sort of estranged from the comforts of parents. Like, Lewis still had his dad, but was sent to England alone, basically, to go to school. Tolkien was an orphan. It was really similar.
Yeah. And similar interests. Also, it was so funny to see how much Tolkien loved making clubs.
Yes, and when you put it in perspective, he had the TCBS, which was like his high school friends. They had this hilarious tea club society.
Yeah.
Then later he made the Apostolics and the Coal Biters, and then ultimately the Inklings. Yes, Lewis Tolkien was obsessed with these little clubs with names.
Always making clubs. The Coal Biters. Lewis was part of that group, wasn't he?
Yeah, he joined. That was their Icelandic reading group. Yeah.
Okay, so it was an Icelandic reading group that didn't overlap. It broke up, and then the Inklings got together. Is that right?
Yeah. So the Coal Biters were just, that was early 30s, late 20s, early 30s. And then that kind of died out before Lewis and Tolkien. Like they were the two that came out of that group that were really connected. And then Tolkien connected Lewis to Hugo Dyson and some other Christians that, again, sort of turned Lewis off with their belief, but was also annoyed with how much he enjoyed them and how they seemed to have a better handle on life than he had.
Well, you talk about the idea that he has this analytical mind that had reached certain conclusions about God or the absence thereof, and then a romantic heart that still, that's with a romantic soul. And I don't know if I'm quoting Lewis or you. I think Lewis. He was fearful. I can't read my own writing in these notes. Essentially, everything I loved, I believe to be imaginary.
Yeah, no, that's Lewis. Yeah. He could not square the circle in his mind of like the things that brought him the most joy were to him lies, were made up, and so there was this kind of a despair at that, because the real world was grim and hopeless. The imaginary world was rich and full of hope and life to him. And, if you read his early works before he became a Christian or even a theist, they're extremely dark. And like much of the generation that came out after World War I, obviously very shattered by the high ideals of the late 19th century that were just totally shattered on the rocks of the horrible trench warfare.
Yeah. I saw something about how many poems were being written in Germany in the years before World War I. It was just insane how many. I mean, not necessarily good poems, but the amount of creative output that was happening right before World War I that just got shut off like a
Oh
tap.
yeah. No, it just, I mean, and Germany was at the height of its cultural power. Like it was everything in theology, chemistry,
Yeah.
art. Yeah, it is really shocking. I mean,
Yeah.
first book I remember, adult book that really caught my heart was All Quiet on the Western Front. And
Yeah.
I read that when I was a freshman, and I struggled with reading. Like if it wasn't fantasy, I struggled with reading, but that was one where it just totally took me. And many of the books that came out of that post World War I generation were all kind of haunted with the same despair, the same grief. And it really, if you look back, it's shocking how optimistic Tolkien and Lewis were
Yeah.
in their works, having
Right.
gone through that together.
Yeah. Well, as I was reading the parts about Tolkien and Lewis and who died and the fact that they didn't, I started thinking about how many people who maybe were as brilliant as those two
Yeah.
died in that.
We'll
and
never know. That's right.
We'll never know. And it's
Tolkien
just,
and Lewis should have not come out. I mean, Lewis barely survived, and Tolkien did not go to the front because he had that trench fever, but his whole unit was wiped out.
yeah.
So it's really a miracle either of them came out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Connect some dots about the relationship between friendship and creativity that you play out in this story.
Well, as I mentioned, I'm a teacher and I run a graduate program in illustration at WashU in St. Louis. And something I say to my students all the time that I'm not sure they quite believe until they've really spent time in a community is that your work always gets better in community.
Yeah.
And I think it's because we believe the sort of liturgies that our culture has taught us about artists, that they're solitary, they're selfish, they're inward looking. And that's usually not the case, that we need others. And we often make our best work when we allow someone else to collaborate with us. It's really the whole story of humanity. I think you could say the entire purpose of human life is fellowship. And so their particular creative community is a perfect example of that. And it's one of the cool things about the more most people know, hey, they were friends, they were really tight at Oxford, they were part of the Inklings, they both were successful. But they really just like Galadriel gives the fellowship the gift that sort of helps them finish their mission, Tolkien and Lewis gave each other like the perfect gift to allow them to make their best work. And for Tolkien, it was just simply like encouragement. Like Lewis loved all of his stuff, read it enthusiastically, wrote pages and pages of commentary, always like met with him when he was stuck. And I mean, Lewis to the end never believed he ever influenced Tolkien on anything, but he was just there as the friend who really helped a guy who just struggled with perfectionism and a desire to rewrite things and a sort of self-hatred of his own work. And then for Lewis, Tolkien just simply gave him the ability to read a story the right way, as Alan Jacobs says, and to see why the stories mattered to him so much. And neither of them could have been the artists they were without the other. Yeah.
Do you draw any distinction between friends and colleagues? I mean, collegiality is important. And I'm wondering, you say you tell your students everything gets better in community. I assume you're not requiring your students to be actual friends necessarily, right?
I love that. Maybe I should. I don't. Maybe I should require them to be actual friends.
Make them go bowling.
Yeah. Actually, we do have a bowling activity we do, but I do think that yes, colleagues, people that trust one another, whether that's in a personal capacity or in a professional capacity, I think all friendship and collegiality requires trust and vulnerability. And I believe there are different levels of that. So, yeah, I think whether that is a relationship where somebody at work and you allow them to read some of your stuff before you send it to the editor, just get a read on it. I mean, that's very vulnerable. And then you have friends that are in a small group or friends that are family friends that are sort of different levels. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that fellowship can look inside and outside of an artistic practice.
Yeah. Okay. You spend a surprising amount of time in this book. I say maybe just made a big impact on me. If I counted the pages, maybe it's not as much time as I thought. But talking about the breakup of the fellowship,
yeah,
which is really sad.
yeah,
because these guys didn't just continue to meet and enjoy and encourage each other for the rest of their lives.
yeah. It's really tragic. I mean, and I really did not want this to be just a hagiography of them. I didn't want it to gloss over the reality of their lives, because their friendship was really beautiful. And really, for 30 years, they were, I mean, it's 20 probably, but between 20 and 30 years, they were extremely close. And yeah, and as time wore on, as they got older, they not only drifted apart, but began to wound one another accidentally, but also intentionally, because they didn't address it. And I mean, if I'm putting them on the couch, I think these are British men who do not talk about their feelings, and who had very few tools with which to really know how to go into these hard places. I mean, they wrote, when they had to apologize to one another, they wrote long letters to do that. We have a few of them.
Yeah. I've seen some of those letters. They're lovely. They
are. Yeah. So I mean, I know they felt all these things, and I mean, they were friendly. It's not like they hated one another. In fact, a thing I cut out in the book is, towards the end of their friendship, Tolkien was almost single-handedly responsible for getting Lewis an academic chair at Cambridge. He had been passed over for many years at Oxford, but it was almost Tolkien single-handedly that went to bat for his friend Lewis to get him that chair of English at Cambridge. So they were still in each other's corners, but the deep connection there, there was a rift brought on by the differences they had in their denominational understanding of just simply divorce. And when Lewis got married to Joy, Lewis was terrified to tell Tolkien about this, because he knew that because Joy was divorced, it would upset him. And so he didn't say anything. But of course, that struck an even deeper blow when Tolkien found out that Lewis was married and had never been told. So there is just this terror. I mean, I'm reading the letters that Tolkien wrote after Lewis died. They're so hard, because he was cleaved in two by it. And I think he died, and Lewis died, with a lot of regrets. And I couldn't help but resist in the book trying to give them a way to resolve that.
Well, but also at this, there was another level that I thought was compelling and interesting too, and that is this: there were some professional differences / jealousies. I don't know if jealousy is the right word, but the Tolkien certainly felt funny about his guy who just became a Christian 10 minutes ago, now writing apologetics books. Yeah. And there is a certain facility with language and ideas in Tolkien. I'm sorry, in Lewis that bothered Tolkien. Yeah. And it may not be fair for me to use the word jealousy there. That may be reading. I don't know if that's fair or not.
I think it was. I think it was a little jealousy. I think you're absolutely right. It was like, hey, I kind of turned you on to this whole Christianity thing, and now you're like literally a hero of England because you were on the radio during the war, reminding the English people to carry on and remember that God is greater than all this crisis. And yeah, I'm sure it felt like totally confusing to Tolkien, and also he could never have done what Lewis did, because Tolkien was they were in a way a kind of odd couple. This is another thing about what's so funny about them. Is Lewis was the brash, outspoken, extremely fast composer, witty, elegant speaker, and Tolkien was all the opposite: bumbling, mumbling, self-critical, and so the two of them together, you can't ever imagine Tolkien making an apologetic book that anyone would ever read. And he could never have brought himself to pretend to be an expert in an area that he's not an expert.
Yeah. And then there's the weirdness with when Charles Williams comes into the group and Tolkien doesn't like him.
Yes.
And then is it Hugo Dyson who's so rude to Tolkien about
Hugo Dyson can't stand he just gets sick of the Lord of the Rings stories being read at the reading group. At one point he says, oh God, more elves, please no. And so Tolkien was very sensitive and Lewis stood up for him in those circumstances. But yeah, Charles Williams was also very brash. Quite a character, was into the occult, was a super interesting guy. Yeah. But he and Lewis just vibed in that way where like you just, I know exactly what was going on. Tolkien was like, this is my friend. Yeah. But you access this different part of him, which actually I don't like about Lewis. And now you're like amplifying it, Yeah.
Well, it's funny because in, I guess it's The Four Loves, Lewis talks about, the great thing about having multiple friends is they access different parts of you and they show parts of you that the other person can't see. And Tolkien must be thinking, yeah, that's what I can't stand Charles Williams.
Exactly. I try in the book, I use that quote right at that moment as the Williams stuff is I'm trying to rebut Tolkien a little bit, but yeah, for sure. I mean, Williams was, I don't know if you've read any of his stuff. It's really beautiful and weird.
I've started some of it. I just can't get through it. I'm just not that interested.
Yeah, it's challenging. But that hideous, like Tolkien, for instance, hated that hideous strength, the third book in the Peace trilogy, because it was clearly like fan art to Williams's sort of obscure style. And Tolkien could sense that like Lewis was kind of doing his best impersonation. And this is another thing that Tolkien was annoyed by. He felt Lewis was kind of a magpie and just kind of picked up shiny things and ran with it. And this was another, he didn't do the hard one sort of world building. Tolkien was making like weather maps and moon charts for all of Middle Earth. So, obviously.
Yeah. While Lewis is saying Santa Claus, sure, why not? Let's bring him in. Let's bring Santa Claus in with the elves too. Yeah,
it's probably amazing they stayed friends as long as they did. But
yeah, well, I don't want to create the impression that this book is about the dissolution of their friendship. But on the other hand, we all know about the good parts, and I'm just so the breakup that you describe. It makes so much sense. It's such a human story.
Well, it's part of why I told it. Like I think we have the ability to learn from them if we apply it to our own lives, and we have those friends we've had for a long time. And I feel in my own heart with my friends that I've known a long time, like we get older and some of our habits get more entrenched and we have less grace to them. And even inside of a marriage or something, you can understand how this kind of lesson is really a human story. And I don't know. I think it's more interesting as a story with this as the ending, that as opposed to like, yeah, they were friends forever and it was always awesome. And
yeah. I don't know what I want to ask about. Is that the lesson of this? Is just be more tolerant, show your friends more grace, and maybe you can be friends longer?
I think if you look at the whole book, like the arc of what is this book about? Like, I actually think that Lewis and Tolkien are just they're the avatars for a much bigger story about the purpose of human beings to begin with, and thinking about why we tell stories, why they seem to matter to us so much. And inside of both Narnia and Lord of the Rings, it's one of the things that Lewis loved about Lord of the Rings is that it's a high fantasy story, but it's actually about home. It's actually about the very simple pleasures that are like, why are all the characters fighting for the thing they're fighting for? It's not to win glory or power. It's basically to protect the Shire. It's basically to go back to the very simple values of like good food, beautiful pastoral countrysides, and a cider at the end of the day. And in many ways, Narnia has the same theme, that Narnia is at the end of Narnia, it's chapter 1 of the story, and every chapter is better than the one before. And so both of them actually center this very sort of humble idea. which I think is a kind of universal question that human beings have about why do we exist and what does our work matter? How will we last? How will we be remembered? And the fact that they had a falling out and that they couldn't achieve that home in their own life is part of that story.
Wow. Yeah. And I love thinking about their story in the context of a story like Leaf by Niggle, where the big tree is, you have to believe they're doing all right.
That's
Their
right.
friendships is restored.
I pulled a bunch of metaphors from that throughout this story, and it's one of those that I hope people read of Tolkien's, that and Smith of Wootton Major, which he claims he would never write allegory, but is of course this beautiful story at the end of his life, his last story, really.
I haven't read it. The Smith of Wootton Major.
It's very quick, and it's illustrated by Pauline Baines, who did all the Narnia stuff, and it's this beautiful, simple story of a child who, when he is young, eats a cake with a star in it, and the star allows him to visit fairyland. And then as he gets older, he has to give the star up. He has to no longer enter the land of fairy anymore. And you can tell it's a man at the end of his life who's like coming to terms with like, I am done with what I have made, and now it is time to give that star to another person. And it's really lovely.
Wow. All right. Well, let's begin to bring this thing in for a landing. I want to hear you talk about the writers who make you want to do good work.
Oh man, where do I start? The first I mentioned the first adult novel I really loved was All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah,
that was an entry into like war books. War books were things that like allowed me to understand the human struggle because there was also action involved, and like I needed some kind of sword adjacent content, But
you said you weren't much of a reader when you were young.
I struggled with it. If it wasn't fantasy, I read D&D books and Dragonlance and Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. But
were you drawing all the time when you were little?
Oh yeah, everything was drawing centric. Yeah, I would do like Star Wars fan art and comics. Read a ton of comics. But in college, I started to read some of Lewis's theological works, but it wasn't until I read Annie Dillard that I understood the memoir, the essay, the literary text as something that could sing outside of a particular A to Z narrative. And so I began to go down the rabbit hole of Annie Dillard, and I read Bonhoeffer the first time in college. At Flannery O'Connor, I started to read, and there's so many of these people that you begin to connect. Like one book leads you to the next, and you realize there's this whole web of things you hadn't really considered before.
Yeah. And then as you said, when the one book leads you to another, you realize that these books are all in conversation with each other, and that you can jump into that conversation. And I guess that's a good way of framing what I love about what you've done in this book, is that you're contributing to this conversation. I actually learned plenty of things I didn't already know. I knew some of it, but even the stuff I already knew, it felt like you were contributing something to that conversation that I found incredibly helpful. So thank you. I mean, I really love what you're doing in this book.
I feel like that is a really hard thing to do, given how much has been written about these two. Yeah. So that's a high compliment.
Well, it is the visuals really did help me make sense of some things that some facts I already knew.
Yeah.
Also, I thought you did a great job of sorting out the timeline in such a way. I can't think of the example right now, but there are things I knew about Lewis's life, things I knew about Tolkien's life, or their bibliography, that I didn't realize they were happening simultaneously.
Yeah. Like how do you stack those together so you have like again, I'm obsessed with this idea. Like when we think about history, we all sort of create this own version that lives in our head, and it's like this accessible nugget. And I just love books that help you access that story, that idea quickly, And so I'm glad this helped.
Well, you did it. All right. So thank you. I hope
Thank
lots
you.
of people read this book. And I can't remember if you said this before we started recording or not. Maybe the target audience is younger readers, but I think grown-ups are going to love this book. This grown-up did. Let's put it that way. So
Okay, that's all I can ask. Is one at a time.
All right. Thanks for being here.
All right, bye-bye.
See you, man. The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.